All right, well, welcome. This is the John Glenn Corvair. It's currently in the museum at Springfield. This is actually a picture of it in the museum. I left it there so people could see it for a while. I've been asked to tell the story of how I came to acquire and restore this 1964 factory AC Monza convertible that originally belonged to John Glenn. My story with this car spans nearly 2 decades, and it's been a large part of my life over these years. I have over 3,000 photos in my library for this car, but tonight we're only going to see a small fraction of them. I'll tell a story behind them, and I hope you enjoy it. And I got a glitch. Let's see if I can. Okay, who was John Glenn? John Herschel Glenn Jr., July 18th, 1921 to December 8th, 2016. He was a United States Marine Corps aviator, engineer, astronaut, businessman, and politician. He's best known, perhaps, as the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20th, 1962. I was 7 years old at the time. He had a long and illustrious life, a highly decorated military career from World War II through the Korean War as an aviator, a test pilot, and his time at NASA as part of the Mercury program. After leaving NASA, he launched a political career and served 24 years as a U.S. Senator representing the state of Ohio. In 1998, he returned to space at the age of 77. He's generally regarded as an American hero and statesman, beloved by all who knew him. And as you'll find out, he drove Corvairs. Why is this? For some reason, the slides aren't. There we go. Let's go to the next slide. All right, the titles reveal the ownership history. I am having trouble getting the slides changed. John Glenn Jr. of Seabrook, Texas, owned a 1964 Corvair Monza convertible. In February of 1966, he sold the car to R.F. Gardner, who lived nearby. Gardner kept the car for about 9 years, selling it to E.F. Perkins in 1975. Perkins was a NASA mechanical engineer who had worked on Project Mercury with Glenn. Shortly thereafter, he retired and moved with the Corvair from Texas to Newport News, Virginia. State inspection records indicate he drove the car for about 5 years, at which point he seems to have parked it. Perkins passed away in 1998. This is his obituary, and this is how I learned of his connection to NASA. Charles Elmore and his son Christopher acquired the car from the Perkins estate in 2000. At this point, the car had been parked and unregistered for 20 years, still sporting the 1980 Virginia license tags. This is the original engine for the car. Charles had attempted to get the car back on the road by installing another engine, as this one had failed. Fortunately, however, he retained this engine and all other accessories, including the factory AC components, and he sold all of those to me. All those came with the sale of the car 2 years later. This is a car as I first acquired it. Years and previous owners had not been kind to it. That's a J.C. Whitney top installed in the 1970s in poor condition. The exterior trim was missing, and the exterior had been repainted badly. Backup and taillights were also missing. A non-stock trailer hitch was present. The interior had been repainted in non-original colors. You can see the hole for the remote mirror sitting there on the door. Much of the interior had been destroyed by time, weather, and rats. There was rat poison everywhere, and the desiccated bodies of 2 large rats were found under the tattered remains of the carpet. A cheap set of aftermarket gauges had been installed under the dash, and a large push button for an Auga horn was screwed into the right side of the steering hub. The seat bottoms and much of the floor were rusted through from the effects of rat urine and weathering. The driver's seat, the seat that John had sat in, was gone, replaced by a black 1963 seat. While I dreamed of restoring the car, at this point in my life, I had neither time nor money to do so, so I just set my sights on getting back on the road and enjoying it. So I stripped the floorboards, repaired them temporarily, and painted them, I put it up on jack stands and completely rebuilt the brake system because if it doesn't stop, it doesn't go. I installed a new top, new tires, lights and trim, another interior, tuned the engine, and for the first time in 22 years, the car was back on the road. We enjoyed it for the next few years, driving it in the summers with the top down, but storing it in the wintertime so it would be protected. In 2003, I actually took it to a Corsa convention in Carlisle and entered it in concourse. And there it is, unrestored. It achieved a score of 73.41, worst in show. Probably gave the concourse judges nightmares for weeks. I also autocrossed it. It was a great little car with excellent handling and good pep. I drove it to several club events and local shows, but as happens, I eventually got busy with other things, too many projects, too much work, family concerns. I was driving the car less and less. You see another Corvair in my garage that I'm working on. And it began to fall into disrepair. So I put it back in storage until I could give it the attention it deserved. As it turned out, it would take me nearly 15 years before I could get back to it. While I was waiting to do that, however, I was still thinking about it, busy collecting knowledge and resources I'd need to do a proper job. I had decided the restoration would have to be factory stock because I wanted it to look like it did when owned by John Glenn, and I figured it looked that way when he owned it. If I ever learned that he had actually modified it in some way, I would have done that, but lacking such, I felt factory stock was the best way to go. I wasn't a stranger to the challenges of a factory stock restoration, having already gone through it with my 1964 four-door sedan, and I knew it to be a difficult task. I knew this one would be harder, mainly because of the relative rarity of factory air conditioning, making certain parts, shown here, nearly impossible to obtain. I spent many years researching factory AC systems wherever I could find them. Junkyards, car shows, swap meets, online forums. I dug through lots of parts boxes. I consulted many sources of information, but no single source is completely accurate. So cross-checking and networking with other knowledgeable people is essential to success. I joined with others who were interested in stock Corvairs, and in 2005, we formed the Stock Corvair Group. We performed research, inspected cars at national conventions, built a Stock Corvair website, and hosted many discussions. We published several articles over those years, including such things as how to decipher the Fisher body accessory codes, interior paint codes, Corvair batteries, washer bottles, etc. Whenever I encountered questions about the Glenn car, I was able to supplement my research by consulting with this fine group of knowledgeable individuals. Some of the people who were particularly helpful in this regard were Kent Sullivan, Mark Corbin, Dave Newell, Larry Claypool, Jeff Stonecipher, Dave Trull, and Paul Sternberg, just to name a few. A perfect factory stock restoration is a goal that you hope to approach, but will probably never fully achieve. Don't go into such a process thinking it easy or inexpensive. It's neither. And this graph is just meant to show you that the quality depends on how much time and money you really want to put into the project. You're going to spend one or another, or more likely both. You will face many problems trying to perfectly duplicate materials, finishes, parts, and techniques from more than half a century ago. Many finishes used in the 1960s are no longer readily available. For instance, turn coating, which was used on objects shown here, was a lead-based product and is largely abandoned due to toxicities and environmental concerns. Lacquer paint, largely abandoned due to environmental concerns and the development of improved finishes. Cadmium and chrome plating, significantly more expensive now due to heavy metal toxicities. Carpet padding looks different from the brown animal hair-based product used in the 1960s. The old stuff is on the left and the new stuff's on the right. Plastics will have discolored with age, and finding replacements of the exact shade may be difficult or impossible. Parts availability. If you don't have an original part that can be reused, or restored, you will have to find or make one. You have 4 options, and none of them are perfect. You can get used parts, swap yards, swap meets, junk yards, etc. But after 60 years, these are becoming scarcer, pricier, and in poorer condition, and they will require time, money, and effort to restore. NOS, new old stock, rare and pricey, and not always correct. NOS, remember, are those parts that were left over from the production run and or set aside for repair. They were not always of the highest quality to begin with, and they are not immune to the ravages of time, nor were they always identical to factory stock. For instance, the 1961-64 ground straps, as they came from the factory, were bare copper, but the replacements were always plated a silver color. Another thing is when GM changed the style of a certain part, such as a rear grille, that part became the standard replacement part for all prior models. Thus, the parts book would list a 1964 rear grille as the correct part for 61 to 63 as well, even though it isn't. Reproduction parts. Sometimes the reproduced part may appear as good or even better than the original. Sometimes it's close, but not quite. And sometimes it fits and works, but doesn't look correct at all. Buyer beware. While reproduction parts will be an essential component of any 60-year-old restoration, this is one area where you must be extra careful to ensure compatibility and avoid veering into the dreaded realm of modified. Self-made parts. He'll do this occasionally. This gives you individual control over the process, although it's often more expense and time. It's mostly suitable for simple items such as these gaskets or smaller repairs such as sheet metal patches. And it's also one area where if you're not careful, you can end up with an unwanted modification. When making a modified car, your choices are yours alone to make. But when you choose to do a factory stock restoration, those decisions are taken away from you. They were made a long time ago at the factory. No matter how much you might hate the color, wish for improvements in the radio, desire fancier wheels, etc., the car with its serial number, Fisher body tag, and other codes makes all those decisions for you. If you cannot accept that, you probably should not attempt a factory stock restoration. Having said that, my first hurdle to overcome was the code 905 on the Fisher tag. That's the paint code for Meadow Green in the upper left corner there. On the paint chart, it looks very blah, very limey green, and I didn't like it, neither did my family. They said, it's your car, do what you want with it. And I said, no, it's not my car. I'm just the custodian. I have to do what the car tells me to do. And that's what I did. And in the end, we were all happy that we did that. Another problem I had to overcome was finding this part. It's the rare remote control driver's door mirror. This particular 1964 version was only used for that 1 year and has never been reproduced. Most of them broke early on, so a lot of the NOS parts got gobbled up, and they were used on full-size Chevys as well, so they've driven the price into the stratosphere. I got very lucky because I had restored the sedan and had done such a nice job with it. A member of the Corsa NC Club, Earl Jones, offered to sell me his NOS remote mirror at a discount as long as I promised it would end up on the Glen car with the same quality restoration as the sedan. So I got this in like 2002 or 2003, shortly after I got the Glen car. And it took me a long time, but I eventually kept my promise to him. Well, the years rolled by. I was getting older and closer to retirement, and I suddenly realized if I was ever going to restore the car the way I wanted, I had to do it while I was still working and had money. So that wasn't going to be much longer. So I had to find somebody to help me do the things I couldn't do. And the one thing I knew I couldn't do was metal work and body work and paint to any reasonable degree. It just wasn't my thing. So I'd been looking around for quite a while to try to find somebody. and did a lot of internet searches and so forth. And I finally found this gentleman named Kyle Yoakum. He had just opened up a restoration shop in the area. If you've ever watched the Speed Channel and you ever saw Phantom Works, he did work at that shop for a while, but he left and opened up his own shop. And after meeting with him and showing him the car and talking to him, I knew I'd found the right person. He understood my goals. I wanted to preserve originality, and I wanted to do as much of the restoration as my skill set allowed, leaving his shop to do what I could not: metal repair, paint, and body. Given the deteriorated and modified state of the car, it was not possible to retain original finishes, but we could at least retain the materials underneath. He made sure to preserve as much of the original metal as possible, while I did the same with all the parts and accessories I restored. We agreed on terms, and so in the fall of 2017, the restoration of the Glen Corvair finally began. This is the last look at the car in its unrestored form. I'm going to click the button and I let it run one last time. I'll tell you, I hated to tear this car apart because it was a great little car. It ran well, but it had to be done. So, now how do I get it to go to the next slide? Okay, stop that. There we go. So I put it in the garage, began the restoration in the fall of 2017, and over the course of several weeks, I disassembled the car down to just a body shell with doors and lids attached. Everything I removed got bagged and tagged, lots of photos taken, and I made lots and lots of lists. Given that the car had been mostly spared exposure to northern winters, the rust on the underside was superficial, allowing disassembly without breaking a single bolt. I didn't even have to use heat. This allowed me to retain, restore, and reuse almost all of the original hardware on the underside of the car. I took detailed photographs and labeling of suspension and steering components so I could later return them to the exact same settings, detailed shots right down to the thread count. Careful disassembly permitted preservation of important items such as spring tapes and coil spring cushions, which were used on air-conditioned cars. Paint was carefully chipped away, exposing original finishes underneath. This was particularly valuable when it came time to deciding the interior color, because we later found out that 2 different shades of fawn paint were used in 1964, and we had to know which one was correct for this car. Photos were taken to document colors, textures, seam sealing, etc. And these were again used in the refinishing phase to return to factory appearance. I purchased a lot of tools during this restoration, but one of my favorite was this easy car lift, which allowed me to get the car up and remove everything from the body, including the suspension as shown here. And I was still able to move the car around with the addition of some optional casters. I spent several months scraping all the undercoating from the wheel wells. Very difficult and dirty job, but all of that was done so I could document what was underneath. Notice it's red primer with overspray. By spring of 2018, the body shell was finally ready for Kyle. So I wheeled it out of the garage and we put it on a flatbed trailer and he hauled it away, leaving me with an open bay in my garage. And I finally had room to work on parts. I had to get all of my stuff done while he was doing the body, so everything would be ready to go together in time. I mentioned that I made lists. Here's a list of suspension and shroud parts that I had previously sent out to be stripped and powder coated. Big stuff I shipped out. Small stuff I would do in-house, but I learned a long time ago it's not worth my time and energy to try to strip a cross member or a control arm. But while they were out getting powder coated, I set up a home plating kit that I got from Caswell, and I proceeded to replate the suspension hardware. That's not as easy as it sounds. Accurate plating requires knowing the surface area. So I made very detailed life-size drawings of a lot of the hardware, partly so that I could calculate, partly so that I could re-identify it later on. Then I turned all that information into spreadsheets with formulas in them to help me figure out how many amps I needed to plate the parts. And the red means no go. I don't have enough amperage to do that, those pieces. Home plating is slow and tedious, so I only used it for small parts. Big parts I sent out. However, it allowed me to keep small parts identified, and I was pretty pleased with the results. Here's a collection of parts that I plated. And here's what they look like when they went back on those powder-coated parts. This is a strut rod, and that's everything you're seeing there is original from the car, except the bushings, of course, those are new. Here's a restored brake. Again, pretty much all original stuff, although I did eventually put on new brake shoes. I also cleaned and painted the original tie rod ends as they were not significantly worn out, and exact replacements are not available. They say they are, but they're not. Remember that exact reproduction thing? They're not the same. I found and purchased number correct original NOS spiral shocks for front and rear. And once I got everything refinished, assembly was rather straightforward. Here's the front suspension. What's new are rubber bushings and bearings, but what's original is everything else. The ball joints are new, but the springs are the original springs, simply powder coated. And here's the rear suspension. The body, meanwhile, had been stripped by sandblasting. April of 2018. There's a dent in the right front corner. I wondered about that, and I didn't know what caused it, but I did find out eventually, and I'll share that at the end of this tale. Underside of the trunk and gas area, and from below you can see all the pinholes in the floor. This is after my temporary patches were removed. So that's what they started on first, was the floor. Although I had these Clark's panels, they don't really fit very well in a convertible. You've got to make special patches, and that's what Kyle's shop was good at. So they made all the patch panels. You can see them on the side there. And they actually removed the seat braces from the floor so that they could do a complete repair. But they carefully marked where they were so they could put them back. And here you see them putting in the panels, and I tell you, everything was put in the way the factory did it. If they were spot welds, they spot welded. If they were butt welds, they butt welded. They're making a patch panel here for a piece of the floor. And rivets were used to hold things in place temporarily until they were welded in. Here's one of those seat braces. It's got a big chunk rusted out of it. So they repaired that. There's just a hole in the floor, and they just simply sealed that up. Wasn't worth a whole panel. And here's your front floor, now replaced. And here's your rear floor. And here's the seat braces back in again. And here's the whole floor. And, you know, it just looks like it came from the factory now. Battery box had been molested. It had been cut open to put a bigger battery. So instead of trying to fix that and trying to fix all the rust in the floor, they simply made a new back and bottom, but they preserved the sides and they welded them back on to the replacement part. So again, as much metal as could be saved was saved. And then of course I found the bracket from another car and they welded that in. Quarter panel, that left quarter panel had a lot of rust and some body damage. So they actually removed that brace for the folding top. You can see it on the left side is there, and on the right side it's not. And you can see that they had to brace, had to weld some braces in temporarily while they were doing this. While I had the brace out, they completely treated it, and then they took care of all that body damage. and they welded the brace back in, and there's your before and after. And I think if you look carefully, you can see how all the rust holes on the left side are gone on the right. They did a good job too, because everything lined up well. On the outside, we had rust on the bottom of the quarter panel, so they cut that out and treated the superficial rust on the outside of the rocker. Kyle made these patch panels, which are have those tricky little indentations on the bottom, those drains, and there he is holding it in place. And then same thing on the other side, on the right side, we had to do the same kind of repair. There's another patch panel they made for that, and once it's in, you don't even know. Doors were done off the car on a bench. I don't know what they were doing with this weird hole in this corner of this door, but we closed it up, even though it was going to be hidden by the door panel. I wanted it done right. Door corners, same thing. Here was some rust around the defroster tube before and after. And of course, this interior gutter on this side had been rusted away. I don't know if the car had sat under something on that side for a while, because there was a lot of rust on that side, but it was all gone by the time they were done. Well, while they're doing that, I'm working on stuff at home. I started off with the engine. I got it out and I tore it apart and completely cleaned it up. And I sent the heads and the crank out to a local machine shop to have them taken care of. And I moved on to other projects until that came back. In the meantime, I ordered all the parts I needed. I opted to put in brand new cylinders and pistons, since this was going to be an air-conditioned car. I wanted not to have to, I wanted to be able to not increase the compression ratio and have adequate cooling. So I went with standard bore cylinders and full fin. And once I got it back, I did the usual. Here I am plastic gauging. That's actually the cam I'm plastic gauging, because I wanted to make sure that fit, and it was well within specs. On the right side, you can see some of the parts I'm refinishing and hanging from my ladder. That's what ladders are for, right? Here's the crankcase going back together again, and the timing mark, and there's your short block. And of course, as I moved to install the cylinders, I ran into the dreaded pulled stud. So I had to back up and take the head off and fix the drill and tap and put an insert in, but it was fine. It all worked, and got my engine put together. And of course, engine stands make it fun, because you can flip them upside down to do the bottom work. And the shrouds had been powder coated along with all the other stuff, so I had put the seals in with the staples. That's tough on the fingers, but had to be done. And here's an engine roughly put together. This is put together roughly about a year and a half before I actually needed it. So I just tucked it away under my workbench and covered up with plastic. And I didn't even bother to start it up first time for about a year after I built it. Meanwhile, they're finishing up metal work near the end of August and September. They got around to the front deck lid, and there was a lot of rust up front because these early 64s have push-in letters, and they would trap water in there and rust out. And you know, it would have been easier to just get a whole new lid, but we wanted to save original metal, so they took the skin off, and they repaired the skin, and they repaired the frame separately, fabricating lots of pieces, and then they treated it all, and they put it back together, and it was perfect. They even put that stupid little piece of foam that was inside there back inside it, but it's not going to cause any trouble anymore because everything's been treated. It was finally time for body work, and for that, it goes up on the rotisserie, and they actually did the rotisserie different than most people do. They built a subframe, and the subframe is two tubular pieces of steel, and they're attached at the suspension mount points. You can see this is attached to the front suspension mount point, and this is attached to the rear point. And this just allowed perfect stability and control. The car could be flipped upside down or at any angle, and we didn't have to worry about any body flex whatsoever, whether the doors were on or not. They never braced this car. Here he is doing some of the body work after the initial sealer's been put on. And this little video shows you how easy it is to work on a dash. And the car is on its side with no doors. Oh, I moved on to the transaxle back at home. I've done a lot of these over the years. Wasn't too worried about it, but once I got them apart and cleaned up, I discovered I had a big problem with. This is just me pulling. I didn't have a press at the time, so I used a big threaded rod to pull the stator shaft out. But I ran into a big problem right here with the pinion shaft. Yeah, it's not supposed to do that. That gear and that bearing should be locked in there tight. The inner race is turning. I don't know if you can see it, and the bearing is moving. So this was a spun bearing, and I had to stop everything until I could secure another pinion shaft. The Power Glides haven't been reproduced like the manuals, so I had to dig around till I found a good NOS one. In the meantime, I decided I was going to need a press after all, so I bought this cheap but efficient one from Harbor Press or Harbor Freight, and I also got all of the original K tools for the bearing for the bushings and the Power Glide from eBay. These are very handy, very handy. I like those. Here I am setting up the backlash on the differential, and on the right side you can see the gear pattern I got. Learned a few tricks on doing this. It was kind of a fun project, and I also bought off of eBay the special K tools you need for setting up the clearance between the Power Glide and the differential. If you don't do this, you're going to ruin your Power Glide. You don't need to have the fancy tools, but I wanted the fancy tools because I wanted to do it the way the factory did it. But you take a measurement first on the Power Glide with a dial gauge, and then you transfer it over to the differential, and it tells you how many, you look it up to how many shims you need. And here's the finished Power Glide. Power Glide has new bushings, bearings, seals, gaskets, U-joints, vacuum modulator. I've got a new high stall torque converter. But when you get around to this side, those are the original shims replaced in the exact same location. Body work went on for almost a year at Kyle's shop. You could see they were able to tip and turn and get at every nook and cranny. They spent a lot of time on the grill, getting that opening right. That's my NOS grill that they were using over and over again to fit it, but they got it perfect. Doors, trunks, deck lids, all those things came on and off periodically during the body work phase so that they could fit everything properly, but they didn't overfit it. I told them, you want to fit it like the factory did. You don't want to make it better than the factory. We got our paint from a PPG supplier, mixed up using the original codes translated into modern formulas. And we did spray outs. There's your meadow green, your medium fawn, and your light fawn. That's exterior and interior. And there's a spray out of meadow green on paint. I must say at this point, I was not liking the color. Lots of nooks and crannies got special attention. Hinges, there were nuts and bolts that were to be painted. They did have to do some repairs. They discovered that the deck lid was warped or twisted, and so they had to slit it here and weld it back up. And they even painted it gloss black, just so they could find those last few final imperfections, and also to make the final spray looks a little better with a black base. Yeah, it was very tempting to leave it that color because it looked gorgeous, but again, I didn't get to make that decision. The car made it for me. I worked on the seats, October through April. I took them down to bare metal, took the springs off, stripped everything, either chemically or mechanically. And then I primed and painted them bare steel because they were never really painted, and repaired any springs that needed to be repaired. I made all the soft pieces. These are the anti-squeak material. This is original, and here's the replacements. And then I hog tied that in. I made replacement burlap and cotton pads, used my sewing machine. Had to put these wires into the burlap though. And to put the wires in, you got to cut them to length, and then you got to bend them all. All right, so you can bring it down here. First bend, second bend. I'm grunting because this is really hard to bend. All right, and then you got to do that on both sides, and you got to make all these wires, and you have to make, and then you got to weave them in through and hook them on the ends. And of course you have to make two of them because you got two seats. So that took a while. Then those get hog tied into the seat, and then your cotton pad gets hog tied in, and then you hog tie your new foam in, and then you put some more foam and some more muslin on, and then you slip the seat cover over, which is not as simple as that sounds. And if you're lucky, you end up with two seats that actually work. And more than likely, you'll have to take a few things apart and put them back together a few times to get it just right. And here's what the seat looks like from the bottom, brand new. And they do the same thing for the rear seat, except to soak that, I made this little tub out of PVC and covered with plastic. And then I filled it with 5 gallons of Evapo-Rust, which is great stuff. And I let it soak in there to take all the rust off. And that's what it looks like after it's been in Evapo-Rust. It's just bare metal, no rust. And then that got primed and painted, and build some more of this stuff. And if you're lucky, you end up with a seat. And the same thing for the armrests. You got to strip them and coat them and glue them, and voila. And then everything got covered up with plastic and shoved in the bedroom until I needed it. Along the way, I'm doing all this small stuff whenever I get time. I put new field coils and armatures in both the generator and the starter. Here, on the headlight buckets, they were completely stripped and painted. And then the headlight adjusters were put back in with rivets, not screws and bolts, because the factory riveted them. I painted or plated or refinished things to the same appearance that the factory did them. The steering box, I saved the original outer case and nut, but internals, I had to go through 3 boxes to find good enough parts to build a good steering box. Kyle painted the steering wheel. This is the only place on this car where the light fawn was actually used. On some cars, it was used on the doors, but in my car, it was only used here. Heater, same kind of process. I learned how to do plastic welding because I even wanted to save the plastic pieces of the car. So this is original piece that I welded in order to make it work. Here's some tower clamps that I got from Corvair Ranch before and after refinishing. Here's the heater box restored. Top frame, same kind of stuff. Tore it apart, found rust, found damage, sent the pieces down to Kyle. He fixed the rust, primed and painted them for me. When I got them back, I put them together. My finger, I had pointing to a rubber piece I had to make. There was a rubber bumper that belonged here. I found a source of rubber from a local supplier and cut it to fit. Before and after on the, you know what they are, the clamps, the whatever, the latches for the top frame. There's the front bow, and on the other side, we've got the spring towers. Now, the spring towers, I could not take them apart, so I just dropped them in Evaporust and let Evaporust take the rust right off the springs. Evaporust does not take away paint or plating, but after this was all done, I clear coated them anyway. All of this hardware that came off the top frame, I had to clean it and refinish it before it went back on. And then, as usual, it got wrapped up and put away until I needed it. Side windows, I didn't have any problem with the front window, but I had the quarters, have chrome bases, and they were badly pitted, so I had to take the glass out and send them out to be re-chromed. I took a lot of detailed photos to make sure I could line them back up again, because when you get it back, you get one shot to shove this back in there. And so I lined it up first without anything, and I made lines, and then I shoved it back together, and it all turned out okay. And anything that was internal to the doors, like these regulators, I derusted them and sprayed them with cold galvanizing zinc. They were originally hot galvanized, but I figured the cold galvanizing worked as well. Vent windows, same things. Of course, the channels were relined. These channels were relined. Air conditioning, I sent these pieces, and only these pieces, out to an outside supplier to be refinished. I didn't trust myself with the evaporator core, and I didn't have the skills for these. But while they were doing that, I was restoring all the rest of the AC components. I made these gaskets I showed you earlier for the evaporator cover and blower housing. I needed a grommet for the rear of the evaporator cover here. The original grommet is hardened and broken in multiple pieces. I wasn't sure what I was going to do for that until somebody suggested I look at the late model engine harness tunnel grommet, Clark's Part C99R. It's an almost perfect fit. You just turn it, this is upside down, but this is this hole, and you just take this hole and make it bigger, and it's almost a perfect fit. It's amazing. There's my restored evaporator, minus a grommet. And I had left the original stickers on that, not that you can see them. They're up against the floor. And this is what I got back. Additionally, I got a receiver dryer recharged and a restored compressor with the original label still on it. Mark Corbin restored the plastic parts of the diffuser. He re-chromed them for me. I used a technique from the antique computer world called Retrobrite for the case. You take it apart, you coat it with 40% hydrogen peroxide hair cream, cover it in plastic, and leave it out in the sun for about half an hour, and it returns it to its original color. It basically bleaches. You can see here originally that it was not this yellow color. And just for comparison, here's the restored piece next to an unrestored piece. I combed out all of these fins myself and painted it, replated that, and this, of course, was powder coated. I finally spent several years on this project, but we finally got enough samples that Cal was able to reproduce this decal that hadn't been available ever, and this sticker is original. These are the pipes. One of these is for a coupe, the other's for the convertible. This is the lower pipe. I cleaned them all up, and I had to get a special wire made for the temperature pressure sender because it's longer than normal. So I made a bridge on it here and measured it out like I showed you, and then Clark made me the longer wire. The evaporator tubes have a rubber drain on the end of them that nobody's ever seen because they long ago disappeared. I didn't have the ability to make it out of rubber, but I made it out of vinyl tubing. I stretched it and heated it and flattened it and painted it. And when it's done, it looks like this. It just looks like it came from the factory. Here's an example of that pipe on the bottom of the car being held in place by an original clamp that's been replated. Eventually, I started having piles and boxes of restored parts, all labeled by system or location, taking up a few bedrooms in my house. So I was getting ready, and they were getting ready for top coating. In May of 2019, they top coated the underside of the deck lid in meadow green, and that was our first really good look at it, and it looked a lot better on a big piece of metal. But before they could go on to the rest of the car, they had to seam seal, and that's where my pictures from before came in handy, because I remember all those pictures of that ugly seam sealing. Well, I told them that's the way you need to do this car. So it's hard to see gray against gray, but they did a good job of making it look factory everywhere they did it. And then we wanted to duplicate the look. So red rust primer everywhere on the hidden areas of the interior, like that. And everywhere on the underside of the car, like that. And then they did the engine compartment in the satin black. And for the trunk, we had saved these cover plates so that we could use them to figure out the right shades of gray and white. And then he did some spray test patterns so that we could agree, which one looked best to us. And this is the result we got. It looks much better in person than in photograph, but it really does look an awful lot like the original factory splatter paint. A lot better than stuff that comes out of those spray cans. You can kind of see the funky seam sealing here. They moved on to the interior color. This is where that earlier research paid off. We knew which shade of fawn to use. And that's the door. And yeah, we painted the kick panel so they'd match. If it was dash, it was painted flat like the factory did. The door frame or the windshield frame and some dash stuff. So finally, they were ready for the final coat. There's the underside of that restored trunk lid. And now, if you notice, there was no masking on the underside of that car, and that was deliberate. Normally, the factory wouldn't have masked this off either, but we did mask the interior because this car had been sandblasted, and no matter how often you clean it, there's always sand that gets loose. So we had to cover that up, but we wanted this. We wanted this factory overspray look on the bottom. And it's beautiful. I absolutely love it. It looks very factory. He finished up all the small parts in the paint booth, and then I loaded up my van. And late October, I rushed down there, and while it was still on the rotisserie, I started restoring everything I could. Well, I had easy access, brake lines. Clips that I had restored to these are original clips restored to a factory appearance, cables, wiring harnesses, heater, braces, horns. Clark had reproduced this drain rubber flap for the rear rocker drain. Got the restored columns and heater boxes. All those parts were getting put in. Here's the evaporator, brake cylinder, washer. And then we moved on to undercoating. So I wanted to get everything in before we undercoated. And still up on the rotisserie, we used an asphaltic-based 3M product like the factory did. And I think it looked beautiful. And then I rushed down there late November with the suspension. Kyle took the car off the rotisserie and put it on 4 very tall jack stands. I just about had a heart attack when I saw the car sitting there like that, but it didn't mind. And everything went in very easily. We had Smitty with us and John Gilliland from my club. And we hooked everything up and lowered it down. And first time in 2 years, the car was back on 4 wheels and out in the sunshine. And I'm really in a mad dash now because I've got only about another month and a half before I got to pack up the house. This is what I call my hero shot. I really love this shot of the car. You can see the American flag in the background. But I was every free moment I had, I was down at Kyle's shop. I was installed the quarter windows. They put on the doors, and then we installed all the weather stripping and the glass and all of that stuff. We installed the top frame. I finally installed the mirror, kept my promise. We put in the dash pad. We put in the front glass, which I had specially made with a date code TC. That means August of 1963. And that was the end of 2019. At the beginning of 2020, they brought the car home to me, put it back in my garage. I put the powertrain in. There's the underside. I put the interior in. The scariest part here was cutting the carpet up front for the evaporator hoses and drains. I put the door panels in, and this is where I'll tell anybody, if you're ever thinking of not paying Clark's to install those nail strips, forget it. Pay them to install the nail strips. Those things are a pain in the butt. I didn't, and I wished I had. But they look okay. There's the whole dash. That is not black. That is a special type of gray paint that I had to search for. There's the seats. And go back a page. If you look very carefully, there's a little red corner down here at the end corner of the door. We forgot to paint it, but a piece of vinyl solved everything. And so mid-February, I took the car out for a test drive, and it handled great. I mean, right from the get-go, it had good handling, even though all I did was put everything back the way I took it apart, right down to the same thread. When they finally did the alignment, it was only off just the tiniest bit. I got the top installed in late March. And if you look up here, you'll see that our house is already sold. So I cut this thing really close. So my wife retired the end of February. I retired a few weeks later. COVID started. We listed and sold our house in mid-March, and we moved at the end of April. The rest of 2020 and up to the present, we just settled into our new home and started life as retired people living in the lockdown world. You know, it was crazy. I basically originally thought I was going to a car show, but with no car show, I just left it alone for a few months. Then gradually went back to work on it. My son came to visit and got a ride in the car with his family. I now live only an hour away from the Corvair ranch, so I go over there a lot. And I managed to find a perfect set of carburetor tags for my car. Those are the correct date code, the correct number, and everything. So I refinished them, and then I refinished a pair of carbs to go with them. And Corvair Ranch charged up the AC with R12 for me. Did the alignment, did some tune-up. I managed to get a battery, Tar Top Delco battery for it. I got 2 sets of tires. These are bias belts, and these are, I'm sorry, the first were radials, and these are bias belts, 650 13 uniroyals. And those are brand new hubcaps and wheel cover centers. I restored a jack. We sent out for some more zinc plating. And then on the last projects I did, January, February, I reproduced the spring tapes. I used the originals as a guide, and I went through hours and hours of looking at fonts until I found the right font and got the right spacing. and got a perfect reproduction. Was able to print them on 1-inch white masking tape, which is the right width, and seal them off with acrylic sealer. And they look just great on the car. There's the right and left rear. And this is the timeline. If you can read it, it shows that we started this in 2017, and we finished up in Springfield. So about 3.5 years. This anything in blue is what I did: disassembly, doors, starter, generator. Anything in purple I shipped out to somebody else, and anything in orange was Kyle. So the car was at Kyle's shop roughly 2.5 years, I think. It's kind of interesting just to see how everything went. I'd owned the car all this time, but had never talked to anybody in the Glenn family about it, because I didn't think it was right to talk to them about owning a junker car. But once it got restored, I felt I had that right. So I finally got up the guts and wrote to John Glenn's son, David, this year. David is a retired physician like myself. He's 75 and lives in California. I didn't think he'd write back to me, but he did. He told me that he did indeed remember the Corvair. And in fact, he remembered it because he had an accident in it. He rear-ended his buddy from driving too close, and caused a lot of front end damage. And that's where that crease in the fender we saw earlier came from. And his biggest fear of his life was going home to tell his dad about it. But his dad was very calm and collected, and made sure no one was hurt, and then walked him through the process of dealing with the insurance company and getting repair. I also had run across this photograph of John Glenn sitting in a Greenbrier. And I wondered about that. And David confirmed that, yeah, they owned a Greenbrier when they lived in Virginia, and they sold it about the time they moved to Texas. So I have this photo of Glenn, and there's also 3 photos of John and Annie sitting in my car, which were taken on July 20th. Those are digitally managed. I can't show them. I bought the rights for this photo so I can show it to you, but the other photos, you have to go to the AP archive site. I may try to get the rights to those at some point. But yeah, so John Glenn owned 2 Corvairs. This is my credits page. Everybody I contracted with, or anybody who helped me in some way. I'm sure there are more people than I've got on here because it's hard to get everybody, but it was definitely a team effort. And I'd like to thank everybody, but the person we all need to thank is this lady right here. This is my wife of 41 years, and she's put up with an awful lot. She wasn't always happy about this project, but she did go from hating the color to loving the color. So there's that. And I just really want to thank her. And I think I'm about out of time. I've got a bunch of photos from Springfield, but I'm going to stop here and let you guys take over.
Well, I want to just say thank you so much, Bill. It's amazing all the level of detail that goes into these really excruciating detail restorations. So thank you for that. But I would like you to tell people what happened in Springfield, because I think it's a great story that you showed a slide earlier of the car being in its concourse.
Yeah, so I told you earlier that the car was in a concourse in 2003, and it got worse in show. I showed it in concourse in Springfield, and it got best in show. So I think it's the only car that's ever been worst and best at both. But I'm a funny little story.
He went first to worst, and also he did get factory stock restored award too, which is a really difficult award to get, and so congratulations to you on both of those, Bill. I got to see it in person. It's absolutely gorgeous. We got a couple quick questions here, so I'm going to go ahead and do those. And so the first question is about the fact that you were very focused on original, but you powder coated a lot of parts.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I alluded to that earlier when I talked about finishes, and I said I had to cut some things out for clarity, but I had something in there earlier about the only choices you're going to get to make in a restoration like this is just how far you're going to go. Remember that time and money graph? I could have had things painted instead of powder coated, and I could have even opted to go for lacquer paint instead of the base clear that's on the paint. Some things are a matter of choice. I decided that the goal here was to make the car appear factory stock. I recognize, and I hope you do too, that this is not an original car, and it never will be. It's a very special type of modification, okay? It's a very special type of modification. Anytime you do anything to a car, you modify it. And I modified my car in such a way as to appear factory stock. And in doing so, I had some choice over materials. For instance, I coated things which were never coated. But when I did that, I coated them so that they looked, at least to most people, like they weren't coated, okay? But I used steel paint over bare steel, that kind of thing. Why? Because I don't want anything to rust, you know? I mean, factory's great, but it isn't an original car, it's a restoration. And my goal was to make it look original, but also, also make it look nice.
And have it last too. That's great.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's see. Another question is, was there any rust inside the eyebrows above the headlights? They must
Yeah.
be asking because they have that.
Yeah, not really. I've seen that before. You tend to see that more in the cars which get exposed to a lot of winter salt. What happens is the tires kick the salt up, and they up inside the wheel well and rust there. Remember, this car was a Texas car that once it was brought up to Virginia, it only had, as far as I know, only had 5 years of driving on Virginia roads, and we don't get a lot of salt on the roads in Virginia to begin with, so it was largely spared from that.
Someone asked a question of what was the original purchase price and year. Were you ever able to know what the original purchase price was?
So, I mean, you can look it up, what it would have been. I have not yet been able to track down exactly when the car was purchased and what the price was. I will tell you that I ran into an ornery bureaucrat in the Texas DMV. I submitted a request for a title search in Texas. And honestly, the rules and regulations don't say anything other than, why do you have a right to request a title search? And the number one reason is you're the owner of the car. So I checked that. I says, I'm the owner of the car. And this bureaucrat said, well, you're not the owner of a car that's registered in Texas. And she says, you've never owned this car in Texas, so you have no right to request this. And she sent the whole thing back. And honestly, I looked it over again and again, and I don't see where it ever said that I had to have it titled in Texas to require a search, but we got stalled on that point for now. I was kind of curious what would happen if I took it down to Texas and titled it, whether she'd let me do it or not. That's where I am right now.
All right, well, that's a good, yeah, I guess you could look it up of what the car sold for in that year. So if anybody wants to do that, it's probably out there.
It would have been, I mean, I was going to have a window sticker made up. Mark Corbin does those, and he puts the prices on them. And we would have just used the standard prices, but I didn't do it because I'd really like to know what dealership it came from. And I don't even know if it exists anymore.
I will say you got a lot of comments out here, Bill, that it was a great presentation, fantastic job. People really appreciating your sharing your journey. And I'm going to end by asking you one question. Would you do this again? Would you do another restoration like this again?
I think you should ask, could I do it again?
You could.
I don't know. At this point, I'm exhausted. I think I'll stick to smaller restorations for the time being.
There you go. There you go.
But big projects like this I'm probably done.
Good. Well, I hope that you guys got something out of this, all the level of detail that has to go in when you're doing a project like this. And then, of course, you can find Bill on the Stock Corvair Group website, and you can find his contact information if he shared anything that you want to know more about. Certainly all his knowledge of how to finish these parts and the different paint finishes and those kind of things. A wealth of information that's out there on the Stock Corvair Group too. So again, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Bill. Great presentation.